All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great. So, hello everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Tommy Jimo Ying, a home designer, researcher, and currently am Cal Professor of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University for this year. Um, and my explorations focus on how cities adapt and change over time, utilizing interdisciplinary methods such as fieldwork, public history, and multi-scalar mapping. Um, and as a faculty fellow at the Urban Systems Lab, this past year, I spent my year exploring two neighborhoods, Jackson Heights and Sunset Park, collecting over 100 photos, dozens of clips, dozens of drawings and models. And my exploration aims to capture the stories from these two neighborhoods, how communities were using or are using day-to-day tactics to design their own public, urging an unfolding narrative of how local rituals cascade into large urban transformations. Given the time today, um, as I was thinking about the presentation this past month, I'm just going to focus on one neighborhood, which is Sunset Park. And therefore, I decided to call this presentation Finding Sunset Park, Multi-Sided Ethnography and Fleeting Histories, a presentation depicting some of the themes I found from my current explorations. But before diving into some slices of life from Sunset Park, I want to make note of what Sylvia Rivera stated in her reflection from 2012, a reflection on the practices and discourses of decolonization. There can be no discourse of decolonization, no theory of decolonization without a decolonizing practice. Our knowledge canons in urbanism, architecture, and design are at a critical crossroad where the boundaries that have been set by institutions and professions have been or had erased forms of lived knowledge. As seen from the ruptures of social justice movements the past 2 years, with the dreading pandemic that is constantly still hanging over us, how do we learn about us again? Materialist studies of architecture and urbanism offers a false sense of stability and reality, but many marginalized people experience their worlds through mobility rather than stability, temporarily occupying space rather than owning properties. We frequent data and archives that hold abstract numbers, texts, drawings, and yet embodied forms of knowing, histories that are transmitted orally or environmentally through memories are not found in traditional archives. So, how do we write for marginalized people? But then, how can we also chronicle histories with them too? Diana Taylor, in her 2020 book, Brasante, describes a new radical act, a method and understanding knowledge and activism through the act of being present. And she stated, quote, "My point here is simple. Instead of using singular knowledge for the powerful and plural knowledges for the subjugated, recognize that we all produce knowledge where knowledge is. What's becoming clearer to many of us, however, is that we, the people I walk and talk with, are among those who will bear the violence of monocultural thinking. These insurgent knowledges, as Foucault noted, are the product of struggle. They form part of the undercommons, what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney described as a recent naming and critiques of the Anthropocene, and a reenactment of the heightened awareness of many costs of this patriarchal, capitalistic, colonial centeredness, and push for more humane or environmentally sound policies. And so her book basically describes this new act, this act of being present as a research methodology, which begins to frame the way I did my work this past um, year. So this act of being present became the way I reflected my own work, spanning across the globe with both colleagues and students. This act of being present for engaged work and with an alliance of thinkers and thinkers creates a ripple of change, of small change, but within a deep trajectory of history. This network led me to begin drawing from other disciplines like ecological sciences and the humanities, like ethnography, um, and ecology, or the understanding of relationships in the biological sciences, coined by Ernst Haeckel, to this notion of studying culture and the discipline of ethnography, which both are really interesting, in which they focus on this notion of relationships. Ecology grounds our understanding the matrix of things, organisms, and their physical environment. Ethnography then breaks that boundary into imagined territories, understandingly that the term imagined is the territory that cannot be measured, all culminating into what I call spatial ethnography, a term I borrowed from fields such as material culture studies, environmental history, and public history. Spatial ethnography merges this notion of thick descriptions, observation of the near fields, the near environment, and this notion of macro level studies of systems and scapes. This exploration includes the conducting of oral histories, as well as architectural history through drawing and mapping, indexing interviews, and then using multimedia to convey a narrative around the neighborhood. So now I'm just positioning kind of all of the like jargons and phrases and definitions into kind of a more disciplinary knowledge or of within architecture and the study of the constructed environment. We can draw all the way back to like 80 BC with Vitruvius, uh, uh, an engineer, and the great Greek writers around looking and understanding our environment. But I am starting in the 1400s with Alberti, who was one of the first to critically unpack architectural space and in a way coined the discipline and profession, boxing it into architecture itself. The study of formal dispositions as well as aesthetics. Um, but as we see in most recent years with social justice shifts and as well as climate justice and environmental justice, the discipline of architecture are beginning to draw from the ecological sciences as well as ethnography as forms to, in a way, deconstruct the boundary created from the 1400s by this guy named Alberti. Um, who basically, in a way, cut off the discipline of architecture from many other disciplines. And then understanding this history, I drew from Hollings figure 8, Hollings and Gunderson's their figure 8 model around succession, as well as combined in Arjun's apodized notion of scapes, as well as David Harvey's notions of spaces, to create this triad of understanding how local stories and engagement can actually cascade into larger urban movements. And so this part here is where the notion of qualitative research as well as ethnography becomes part of the successional change in cities and urbanism. And it creates this notion that the city is actually a medium, choreographed by these socio-natural relationships, where natural systems are actually expressed and are understood by social rituals and practices of the people. So there are many architects in kind of postmodernism, like Rossi, who argues that our sites, our cities are actually these layers of collective memory, as well as Andrea Kahn, who illustrates that our cities are actually very contested to the point that we can't understand our cities without understanding how people and the natural landscapes are actually intersecting as part of the making of the city. And so it becomes a social and an intersection between social and natural flows, as well as communication between people rituals, human rituals, a transcription mediated through people, materials, policies, natural systems. And I'm arguing that then architectural research and research around urbanism then should begin to react and become these mediums where we draw from the science, but as well as the humanities, like ethnography. And with that in mind, that was how the field work was framed and carried out throughout this past year. And this is a timeline of where and when the research actually started. And so we have the start of the pandemic, and then I became a faculty fellow later in the year of 2020. And the start of the first few months was really around basically this sense of like remote sensing, but how do you engage with communities from your bedroom? And then soon turned into on-site field work in January. Um, and actually utilizing the urban field as diary. And then in the summer, when a lot of our COVID restrictions were beginning to lessen themselves, as well as restrictions and mandates became much more um, uh, much more open for people to meet again. I was able to gather around 15 to 20 one-on-one interviews with my RA over the summer, as well as more on-site field work. All right. So Sunset Park is located on the western coast of Brooklyn here. Between the coastal infrastructure of Bay Ridge Channel and Ninth Avenue. As a coastal neighborhood, it thrives as a small community where the community was heavily labored around industry, around trade. In the 19th century, with the rise of physical infrastructures, the neighborhood grew as more residential development followed kind of the making of transit hubs. By the 20th century, at the far right, um, many Chinese, Hispanic, Latino immigrant communities began moving to Central Park and making it home following the decline of industrialization and redlining in Western Brooklyn. And this resulted in informal settlements and constructions that follows the production of belonging. Um, Interestingly, in 2017, there was this huge kind of replanning, comprehensive planning of Sunset Park, but as much more towards the piers of Sunset Park and Red Hook, which drove a lot of the kind of rethinking of the industrial buildings that used to be factories for the neighborhood. But in just this past year, the GOV declared kind of the rezoning and replanning of 7th and 8th Avenue, which is basically at the edge of Sunset Park, but also the heart of Sunset Park, especially for the Chinese immigrants who are currently living there. And in a way, the research is somewhat contesting it, but without contesting it, because my research and exploration itself is really about elevating the stories being captured, not about contesting comprehensive planning from the city. That's really not my goal. And so from its historic townhouses to its modern apartments, the neighborhood is actually this vibrant inherent bricolage of semi-historic sites that is and continues to be shaped by the set of divergent social, morphological, and demographic changes. Um, we have building fronts, streets and sidewalks, alleys, reveals kind of these different moments and patterns of inhabitation as they become repositories for memories and rituals for the diverse characters of Sunset Park. This is a voice, a little snippet of an uncle. I'm going to call him uncle because I want to keep my interviewees actually anonymous, but an uncle who talks about how Sunset Park is actually this transitional spaces for many immigrant families. But in this case, the kind of older traditional Chinese population and these new immigrants from China.
But I guess Sunset Park is really a stepping stone. But also, I guess another interesting fact is that at the very beginning, I think we attracted a lot more traditional immigrant population moving into the area at the time. Probably a lot of people from Manhattan, Chinatown, for for much more affordable housing costs and bigger opportunities and things of that nature, and also in Flushing, Queens, and other parts of the city. But however, since the early 2000s, basically, I think we are attracting a lot more of Fukienese population that are moving into the area, and those, unlike the traditional ones, a lot of times they are undocumented, and maybe their children are, their children are born in the U.S., but however they are without documents and things in that nature.
And it is here where I begin to examine this notion of transitional bodies, fleeting histories that are sometimes not captured, but then sometimes a risk when it is captured. So I begin to examine the neighborhood not just through mapping and understanding the physical, but the ephemeral and temporal tactics of the everyday. Um, an employment of what Clifford Geertz would call thick description, a method of interpretation and ethnography to analyze how the city is actually this complex natures between these kind of solid and voids that are very static, but also these bodies that are constantly moving and traveling, and at times uh, hiding from the things that we see. So in a time when it was really hard to interact with people, as well as these social injustices that was increasing in our world, um, uh, I kind of shifted to this fleeting kind of ethnographic approach. What I'm calling it fleeting ethnographic approach that starts with just being local and actually walking. Um, And so I spend my time in Central Park weekly walking. Um, and walking, as declared by Ian Board, is a political act, right? It offers us a visceral and everyday reminder that our sidewalks are actually places of democracy and belonging. It offers us the opportunity to be visible to friends and strangers, as well as participate in each other's lives. But much of the world around us uh, is also designed to control this peripatetic freedom to explore. So what happens when we choose to walk in here? To actually walk and see the lives that are actually around us, to walk and digest what's actually currently happening. Walking with curiosity challenges tribalism, right? Distrust and fear that social etiquette and more seems to enforce. So when we do so, we may learn that the world around us is in fact an artifact filled with multiple ecologies as well as um, uh, social rituals, right? Artfully produced, nurtured, and left over by humans, animals, plant life, and actions. This intersection between flows, matter, energy, and rituals. And then just using whatever I have, especially my phone as a tool because it geocodes a lot of my images. And so photography and geocoding photography became a way of actually documenting these fleeting histories as I walk throughout Sunset Park. So this would be one slice of 3 hours in Sunset Park. So the journey then started in January after 3 months of actually planning and going to community boards meetings. Um, and then when I gathered enough kind of courage to fit myself into layers of clothes during the Chinese New Year, um, I started walking, looking, listening, seeing, and hearing, right? I followed kind of statics that were spouted by radios. The life of 8th Avenue echoes from cellars and windowsills. After almost a full year being down by the pandemic, lights of the red lanterns gleam glimpses of hope to welcome the new year. Pops intercept as mothers divide fireworks amongst their sons and daughters. Pockets of hope spills onto the sidewalks in pink and purple. Streamers and confetti disintegrate as laughter fade into the static once again coming from the windows. And so through these weekly walks, exploring and being, traces of it in habitations begin to engulf balconies, sidewalks, and even hidden places. A typology emerges where unregistered constructions and closed hanging lines weave the front facades as residents adapt new functions to static townhouses. Streets becomes ensembles of products and services. where making and industry begins to temporarily engulf the sidewalk, right? A new urban loggia of Brooklyn. These glimpses then are transcribed into sketches, my daily sketches, where I begin to draw out a lot of the insurgent practices in Sunset Park, and then from that, using Google time lapse to actually understand the life of the buildings, exploring the kind of the how these buildings are hybridized throughout time. And in this case, usually it's just the span of a decade from Google time lapse. Um, and then modeled these kind of insurgent practices where the buildings that are designed by developers and architects then are also vessels for these communities to begin to create new spaces outside um, for themselves. And in this case, this was interestingly also a kind of sewing and laundry room for this townhouse. And I did not uh, know what was actually happening until like the last week of August, where the grandmother actually caught me taking photo of the little townhouse, and then it came down and it was like, why are you taking photos of my little balcony? And then I was able to talk to her with my broken Chinese about the project, and she was talking about how that's actually her making space for the family because there's no space inside of her townhouse because she lives with her son's family, and so that's her own space where she began to use found materials like wooden cabinet doors, glass doors, bed frames to create this outside space, interstitial space for herself to sew and actually mend some of the clothes from her family. And then that became a way of actually documenting the site. Looked at individually, these plates might sometimes appear very discrete and discontinuous. We have a floating apartment with a sushi factory that hinges on an internet cafe, a hidden seafood restaurant within one of the Brooklyn's typical row houses that are open only from 8 p.m. to 12 a.m. in the morning. An apartment building that is erected amongst other townhouses, but encapsulates an internet cafe as well as a laundromat on the ground floor for teenagers in the neighborhood to actually use as homework spaces throughout the school year. Um, and then we have this one building that became really special over the summer because there was a grandmother who talked about how that was where she first lived in when she came to New York
You
City.
never will believe what happened. I get married when I was 18. I get married March. I still was in high school. June 5th, I already was in New York. I finished high school, I came to New York. And I say, oh my God, I go to New York with high school, I am somebody there. High school, I am somebody high school. I came to live in one room across the street. On 462, when you pass, you will see the building, small house is in that side. I think it's 462, something like that. I was living in the third floor, all over in the back, one room. When I came to live there with my husband at that time, I stayed outside because it was my first day here, and I said, "Oh my God, I see so many people." You know, in Spanish we call persona mayor. It's like older people, elderly in English, you know. And I always say, "Oh my God, so many people, you know, old ladies. I would like to know what that is. Oh my God." Never put attention. I don't have time, and I don't speak the language. So the person that came to live, he was on accounting, and he said, "Grisel, I need that you please answer the telephone and then I will give you some money, because he was in business and he need to do the numbers and everything outside. Starting with that telephone ring, I almost died. I don't want that the telephone. I don't want the money. I don't want nothing. I don't want. The only thing that I know that one is that the telephone do not ring, and the telephone ring, and I need to answer. So don't ask me what I say, what they say. I answer the telephone, and I say this is not for me.
And eventually, grandmother Courage actually moved out of 462 from her experiences there, and actually got a degree, and is now one of the great leaders actually leading kind of social justice movements in Sunset Park. So piecing it together with stories, these buildings then begin to tell us tall stories about how this neighborhood is actually created, not just through architects and designers and planners and ecologists, but also people from the bottom up, uh, uh, immigrants in this case, from the viewpoint of grandmother Courage. So, but
Tommy,
so what?
this is Tommy, just to interrupt really quickly. This is so
Huh?
amazing. Just maybe 2 to 3 minute warning, so we have time
Okay,
for other folks too. Okay, amazing.
okay. Uh, so when we see all of this together, special coherence emerges as if the small scale messiness were deliberate and designed as an ensemble. This is the strip. A theater opens as prop symbols on 7th Avenue. Umbrella sprouts straight as the shoe repairer opens his shop for the day. Chefs begins grilling and steaming rice rolls as the sound of carts follow grandmothers and grandfathers swaying their heads from one side to the other. Sounds, smells, and atmosphere triggers wide-ranging memories and feelings. The differing narrative wafts throughout the minds of the community as they are lured into the roles of the street. My current journey has used methods of documentation to capture traces of place and belonging for this current exploration. In the case of Sunset Park, this historical site, these buildings and streets are constantly changing uh, by those who calls this place home. And yet there is no doubt that these characters are continuing to change it, and in these kind of fleeting histories are still unfolding in ways that cannot be documented. Um, so through these interviewing of people, ethnographic research, as well as field work, it comes one step closer to gathering these stories. Um, and begin to test this notion of community engaged scholarship um, around kind of our understanding of our cities as well as urbanism and design. It doesn't come in the fruits of our labor nor in the grace of our intentions, right? It is in our kind of ability to preserve and see beyond ourselves and use the time to actually understand that the city is actually more than the systems that we tend to look from the top to the bottom. And then I just want to end up with grandmother Pretty, who I interviewed right before I came to Pittsburgh. And her interview basically talks about how younger people in Sunset Park need to talk with older people who are actually trying to help the neighborhood out. And she basically says they're older now and they tend to get lost, but they still want that relationship with the younger people. Thank you.
So great, Tommy. There's so many layers and things to really dig into here. Maybe we'll just hold immediate questions towards the end of the session so we can kind of get some other folks going here too, but this is amazing. Thanks, Tommy. Let's move on to Rory and then we'll end with Audrey, and we'll just try to keep our eye on the time, but we might need to stay a little longer, just 10 more minutes. That's cool with folks.
Great. Thank you, Tommy. That was amazing. Am I good to share my screen, Chris? Yeah. Great. So thank you, everyone. Thanks again, Tommy. It's really nice actually to hear your presentation right before mine, because I also spent a lot of time doing ethnographic work in Lisbon last year. And also that's sort of where I'm going towards currently doing research, but also in the future. But I'll start first with what I was doing last year in Lisbon, which many of you do know, but I guess we always see things a little bit differently as time goes on. So hopefully it's still interesting. So first of all, why Portugal? I moved to Portugal last year for a number of reasons, but I found that the city of Lisbon that I moved to was a really interesting laboratory for looking at the relationships between people and the networks that they create, specifically in terms of urban food systems. And so the following presentation will talk about the networks that I drew between different people that I talked to, whether organizations that were themselves food co-ops or local farmers, or people working on food sovereignty or food security for immigrants or disadvantaged populations. I'll present 3 case studies from Lisbon among the 15 organizations that I looked closely at, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I'm beginning to do now, looking at networks of resilience in Cuba, but I'll talk more about that later. And then I have a few questions as a group that we could talk about if there's time. So why was Portugal interesting? There isn't a lot of rural out migration in Portugal because it's such a small place. So you have this tradition of having locally produced food just outside of the city, which creates a much different context than in most places. For example, in New York, we have food shipped in from hundreds of miles away. In Lisbon, you often actually have your own family piece of land just outside of the city, where you'll go to, say, during the weekends and bring food in, or you have families still out there that there's an exchange. So there's already this sort of community-oriented scale that exists. And at the same time, there is also a history of producing food within the city. Portugal, for a long time, was under a dictatorship with Salazar as the leader. And for all it's worth, he actually had some really interesting urban food planning systems where he would have green squares within the city itself, required allotments, also required sort of competitions of who had the best small garden. So there was this tradition of greening in the city that exists today. And post the 2008 crisis, a lot of people actually went back, almost sort of like victory gardens, and spent more time on their own local plots of land. And that's when the Green Plan was developed around the 2007, 2008, which then led to a lot of actually EU funding, which allowed in between the years of 2009, 2013, a massive green plan across the city, where if you've ever been to Lisbon, you'll see all along the Rio Tejo, you'll see a lot of urban sort of cycling paths and whatnot. And that's what happened in 2009 to 2013. Post that, a lot of agricultural parks opened. One of them that has the most funding is called Monsanto, which I'll talk about a bit later. And surrounding Monsanto are a lot of low-income housing. So a lot of projects are going on to incorporate sort of food forests and sort of ownership for these people that are mostly immigrants to have access to this green area. And another part of this is paying attention to green corridors throughout the city. So there's a lot of work being done, which is why in 2020, the city actually won a lot of funding from the EU, which they're currently implementing via bicycle paths and whatnot, but also through urban agriculture. So I was just saying, there are these green corridors, there are all of these EU beneficiary of funds, there are nature-based solution programs. However, there are also a lot of diverse organizations that are, though in some way they collaborate, they also are not that organized, and they're also underfunded, despite all of the money that the municipality is getting from the EU. So there is this separation between grassroots organizations and sort of the legislative values in the city. So for my research, I sort of mapped out all of the different initiatives that I was looking at. And there are more definitely in the city that are smaller, but these are sort of the ones that had the most going on and had actually been around the longest, because longevity is also always an issue within these organizations. And it's everything from Nom Mushrooms, which collects coffee grounds from all the local cafes and grows mushrooms in it, to an aquaponics project that's going up on top of a rooftop in one of the most sort of diverse neighborhoods of the city, and Farm Code. These are sort of the technical initiatives I'm naming because they are quite interesting, which is an app that teaches children how to garden, and you have your own little sort of window box that you take photographs of and share it with the other children, and keep tabs on whose plants are doing well. And that actually was the winner of a specific EU funding award where you get 20,000 a year to keep it going for 3 years. This tells you a little bit more. I sort of then separated it out into the different aspects. So there were community kitchens, there are the markets and the co-ops, one of which I'll talk about a bit more later, Rhizoma, which is very similar to the Park Slope Co-op, actually started by a woman from New York and her Portuguese partner. And then there are community gardens, of course, one of which I'll also talk about, which is part of the University of Lisbon, which is partially why it is successful, because it actually has university funding, however limited, it has some. The tech initiatives that I was talking about, a lot of permaculture is present in Portugal as a whole, which is a really interesting sort of thing to go into as well. And Permalab being one of the most successful and located just on the outskirts of Lisbon and funded by the Lisbon University. And then all of these are outreach projects that are certain that are more tailored to really like working with different people in the community and bringing in diversity, because as we all sort of know, urban agriculture can often be sort of an aspect of gentrification, or it's not always inclusive of all communities. So Rhizoma is what I began to talk about, which is the co-op. And I think what I focused most on in talking to all these organizations were 3 questions, or 3 major issues, which was this thing I was just saying of like culture, class, race, and how urban farming can enhance inclusion and value sharing. The second is land ownership and sustainability, not just for those who are farmers, but for also those who are in the city, as I was saying earlier about the people living on the outskirts of Monsanto who are immigrants, and how do they have ownership of the city that they often can feel a little alienated from. And then the third is community buy-in and resilience. So Rhizoma is an interesting case study because there is sort of a network of people who are really involved in sort of getting food from farms that's left over or ugly, or even soup kitchens and whatnot. But it doesn't involve all people from the community. Sort of like what Tommy was saying, there's these people that are older that are separated from the ones that are younger. But in this case, it's the younger sort of citizens coming in and building these things, and the older Portuguese don't always want it. And so there's a lot of sort of back and forth of how to sort of connect the city so it doesn't have this this feeling of alienating maybe those that are older or never fitting in for these younger projects. And the second case study is Rebundance. This is the organization that meets every Wednesday. I never got to go to a meeting because it was during COVID, but now they're back up and running. And they meet with local stakeholders that are part of Monsanto, this big park, as well as a few members from the municipality, and mostly people that are immigrants or living in the low-income housing, and teaching them about land values and farming and food sovereignty, as well as being able to be like entrepreneurs of their own ecosystem and of their own city. What I heard from Rebundance as one of the biggest issues was that they don't have a lot of support from the local municipality. So with Rhizoma, sort of this support from the community itself, like older residents of, or more traditional residents of Lisbon, not understanding the mission. With Abundance, it was often the municipality that didn't understand why this was so important, this sort of, or not funding, whether they thought it was important, doesn't matter. They weren't funding these sorts of meetings, this outreach. And they were constantly working to sort of show that this is really beneficial to teach people how to grow their own food, about nutrition, and just simply involving them as members of Portuguese or Lisbon society. And then the third case study was the PermaLab, which is a permaculture farm with the Lisbon University that does a lot of outreach. And they incorporate a lot of volunteers, do a lot of community kitchen classes, cooking classes, or how to make compost or grow your own food. And what they found is that they have a lot of support and a lot of enthusiasm, but never any follow through with volunteers. And they always say that this sort of goes back to funding, because volunteers can't stay with you for so long without and somehow getting like paid for that work. So they were saying, again, it would be helpful if they had this sort of legislative support. So what now? So that was the Lisbon context of what I was founding, what I found, which is essentially that people have a lot of power in their communities, and people really have interest in growing food in cities. It's not necessarily going to provide enough food to support that city. There's hardly the technology, and in a lot of places, there's definitely not the resources. But there are these really powerful community networks. And I started doing a project in Cuba this summer because I took an international field program there, and I got really interested in this idea of the decentralized sort of the illicit decentralized activities that happen in Cuba because it's such a centralized economy. And so I've been working more and more on looking at how people have formed these sort of social networks and are beginning to, we're not beginning to, but they're now have the legislation to have projects go on that are not technically allowed, that are now allowed by the government that weren't before. So you can have your own private enterprises. And a lot of people are moving into the realm of urban agriculture or permaculture because the centralized farming in Cuba is pretty disorganized. For example, like they have all of the tomatoes shipped to the tomato factory. And from there, the tomato factory ships the tomatoes throughout the country, which of course doesn't make a lot of sense. You could just go directly to the shop. And in the meantime, a lot of those tomatoes rot. So people are beginning to grow their own food and have these really interesting networks of sharing that food among one another. So that's what I'm working on now. And I have the plan to go there in the spring once I've read more. So yeah, some questions that I've been thinking about, and maybe with people's backgrounds, they might have something to say, but the third question is actually the most important to me, which is how can all citizens feel equally empowered by local initiatives? Especially in New York, I see that that there's sometimes some segregation with who's involved and who isn't. And then of course, these other questions about how do we support volunteers, and how do we get the municipalities of cities to invest in the things that seemingly seem obviously important, but perhaps don't have the funding that they should. Thank you.
Really good questions, Rory. Yes, thank you so much. Wow, wow, wow. I was secretly chatting with Audrey, and she's okay with maybe presenting in a few weeks so that we have a little bit of time to just dig into what we just heard, these two really amazing presentations. So let's open it up to some quick feedback, questions, things that you want to respond to. Maybe we can start with Tommy's presentation if anybody had thoughts.
I have a question, Tommy, and thanks for your presentation. I'm curious where and if you're thinking of taking this further or continuing the research, and if so, kind of what you're looking at.
Yeah, it's really funny because I've been trying to get the archive live, but I've been negotiating with community the people I've talked with, you know, and this is, I mean, this is engaged scholarship. Every, you know, like it's this negotiation, this co-creation, of like going back and forth. Oh, I don't want this to be in there, and you have to edit this out, edit this in. I said this, and I was like, okay, okay, but it's great. So that's still in the works. Because then I'll be able to get a lot of these things out. But I think I was able to connect with the librarian from Sunset Park, and she was talking about how this would be so cool if like a curriculum could come out of it for the library with students who can actually like document their parents' stories, right? Um, and I thought that would be really cool. But it's still all in the air right now because of, you know, like all of the things that, you know, all of the mandates that the in New York still has and all of that. Um, yeah, but it's really like um, I think my goal for now is to be able to get the archive up. That's my goal with the like okay from all of the people I've interviewed. Um, there, you know, it went through like a good amount of them. There's only like 3 people, and these are like leaders from Sunset Park, so they're a little bit more critical. Um, especially the uncle that was talking about the transitional space of Sunset Park. So that's my goal right now, is to get that, you know, out, and then use that as a form to elevate the communities that are currently living there, but as well as the people who I've interviewed with. And I think that was really my goal overall after like talking with all of them. Um, and that's why I was, you know, stating that like my research and my exploration was really not to like impact the DOB's like rezoning of 7th and 8th Avenue. Like everyone I talked with, you know, thought I was from the DOB, you know, actually gathering the stories, right? But they were like, the DOB stopped coming to us in March and they're implementing in the fall, right? And I was like, I'm not from the DOB, but what I could do is take your stories and actually make illustrations and draw out the rhythms that the life, right? That's currently happening. And you know, once it's out there, it's out there. And you can't, you know, no one can really say these stories are not from Sunset Park. Um, so that's really my goal now. Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds amazing.
Maybe I can raise a question if that's okay. And just tell me we're recording this, so feel free to not answer. But in a sense, you're both a facilitator of co-design and research. You know, you're pursuing this as an archive, as the archive, as an ethnography, and you're using qualitative principles. So it would just be lovely to hear how you're taking the very fresh and kind of fluid approach and skills to sketch and to elevate. Really, the elevation is what.
I can't hear you anymore.
No, anymore. Can anyone else hear me?
I can hear you, Daniel. Yeah.
Okay. It's along with the question, so I start again. Yeah, so you are having a quite fresh approach to elevate these stories. Tommy, do you hear me? Yeah, so I mean, it communicates in this sort of hybrid space of being fluently architectural language, but you're using ethnography as a structure, the archive as a modality, and you're starting to code and classify to just make this sort of a coherent project that fits also in the academic rubrics that you're engaging in, including at Carnegie Mellon. So without getting too much in sort of personal details, my question really is about the balance between sort of the methodology of the academy and you know, making it fit so that this is legit enough. So if you're working as a co-creator with the department, that this sort of holds, versus, you know, forms that are extremely timely, fresh, could be a podcast, could be some other sonification and field work, and is not looking necessarily on fitting, you know, certain coding principles of qualitative research with a capital R. So how do you approach this? You know, since part of your success is to bring sort of a new approach to this, and at the same time, I hear and feel your urge to make the archive ready to be an archive worth building on. So just some thoughts would be great if possible.
You're on mute.
I think that's interesting because that's really where I'm sitting. Like it's really this interesting kind of boundary between academia and then engaged scholarship, and actually like knowing and understanding these lived knowledge from these communities. But I think it always comes down to like the risk of whose story that I'm trying to portray in the archive, right? Because stories can heal and actually build cities, but then stories can also harm and burn cities down. And I think that's really the kind of the way that I'm trying to approach this. And even with capital R research, because I had to go through the IRB and everything, and the way I was able to say, in a way like step outside of this capital R kind of research is that if I'm focusing on the individual stories without making a clear and distinct conclusion out of these individual stories, then I'm able to keep all the nuances of these stories inside of the archive without declaring, like, because of all of these stories, this is Sunset Park and this should happen, right? Because these stories aren't really saying that things should happen or things shouldn't have happened. And that's my take on it. And I think this is really drawing also from Diana Taylor's writing, is that there's really no chronicle way of actually like using people's lived knowledge, because it's really experience in human. And I think the archive in itself, although can be used in, because the archive is data, can be used in other forms to hurt communities. I think with the intention that I'm going in, hopefully the archive is used as a form to elevate these stories and not as just something for other ethnographers or hardcore researchers to use to speculate.
I appreciate that, and I'm sure what you haven't said is some of those folks are probably very proud of their stories, of how you have elevated them. That's hopefully feedback you get too.
Thank you.
I'm just impressed by the depth of the work, and it's very tactile too. There's a sense of like building these models perhaps, and like having an exhibition, and the stories are coming out, and we have the narratives in a book, Tommy. But I feel like this is like really an amazing starting point for like a long-term engagement with different communities, and maybe there's a comparison, contrasting moment where you're in Pittsburgh versus New York, and seeing those overlaps perhaps could be interesting too. I don't know if you've thought about that, but. Other questions for Tommy, and also for Rory, thinking about food systems.
I feel like I'm going to have questions for you later when I get to absorb everything that you said. But thank you both, because I think both your research, there are overlaps, like Rory was saying, like just the way that you're kind of seeing people creating spaces within the community and how much power people have. And I'm curious about the methods, because my work is going into spaces where I'm trying to find those networks also. So it's kind of like what you're doing, Rory, but at the same time, I want to see, I want to get people's perspectives, and I don't want the research to be necessarily research with a capital R. In the same way, I want it to be community-oriented work. And then out of that kind of, I do want to ultimately extract some theories or some approaches to policy. So I am kind of curious about how like those stories can impact better policy. I know that's not what you are necessarily going in for, and there's just as much validity and use to just documenting people's lives. But at the same time, I am curious how it empowers, like how those stories ultimately can empower that conversation, and how you think the community could use that. That was the end of my question.
That's great, thanks. Any quick responses, Tommy, or are you able to hear us okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, I think that's interesting, because like even in the, you know, like in neighborhoods like Jackson Heights, the other neighborhood that I'm working and interviewing in, where you might kind of have this notion of like, oh, everyone should know each other. They don't, interestingly. And so like actually like being able to capture these stories, and then through an archive or through podcast or some other art forms, make it visible, actually allows for these community groups or people who don't know each other to actually begin to make these connections. And that may lead to like some grassroots kind of action from the bottom up. In most cases, right, a lot of policies and policymakers, developers, designers really don't look at kind of these type of documentations. But for people who are from the bottom up, people who are grassroots leaders, who are really looking at people and actually connecting tactilely with people, this becomes something that they can actually use. You know, interestingly, the work that I was able to do in Sunset Park this past year, I was able to actually like bring some of the leaders together who have been working in Sunset Park for like the past 30 years, but don't know each other, right? They know the same like, you know, like police station or the police department that they go to every week. And, you know, they probably like walk past each other and doing really great work, but don't know about each other. And I think, you know, like having these stories as an infrastructure in itself then becomes something that can actually create impact in these neighborhoods. And kind of like much more like top-down work, I don't know how the exploration itself might impact that, because it really comes down to that person who's controlling all of the movements from the top.
Beautifully said. Thanks, Tommy. And maybe just for Rory, just a quick comment too. I wonder, because I think the point about multi-generational knowledge and getting folks together across these divides is really critical. And I wonder if there's like literature, traditional ecological knowledge, looking at how different Indigenous communities have navigated that might be interesting to kind of pull from as maybe some strategies. And it's like, how do we translate that then to these urban spaces in different kinds of scales and trajectories could be interesting. I don't know if you've thought about that at all.
No, that's a really good idea. Yeah, definitely.
It could be good.
Yeah,
and of course, Lindsay Campbell is like the person, I know that you're sort of in dialogue with her, but the Stu Map stuff and the stewardship networks, like she's the person, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. All right, folks, so I think we're going to wrap up unless there's any final thoughts. But thanks again to Tommy and to Rory. So wonderful to hear updates on your work. And we'll hear from Audrey just in a few weeks, and also Belen, and hopefully some other faculty and PhD fellows as well. Jen coming up soon too. But thanks so much for coming here tonight, y'all. And I'll share out the recording for folks who couldn't make it.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you, Rory. And thanks, Audrey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Nice to see
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
See you guys soon.
So I have to rush out to catch a train.